let's get started. Dear Dean Wadenhauer, dear guests, dear Professor Geber, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, a very warm welcome. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome you to an inaugural lecture in the main ceremonial hall of the University of Vienna. Inaugural lectures exist for several centuries and are important symbolic pillars of university life. They represent central milestones in academic careers, allowing appointed professors to publicly introduce themselves to the academic community at their new alma mater and mark the beginning of a new academic and personal chapter. For the university, they symbolize the successful completion of an appointment process. Prior to this, there is a highly competitive, elaborate process of selection, of negotiation, and ultimately the obviously right decision to join the university. Appointments are the most crucial elements of university processes and decisions. The future direction of a university, the research and teaching quality, and thus the excellence of a university are strongly determined by appointment decisions. As a vice rector, I'm responsible for the infrastructure of the university. A good infrastructure is a necessary condition for the success and the excellence of a university. However, good infrastructure is useless without academic excellence, without our efforts to attract the best minds. In the 659-year history of the University of Vienna, numerous professors have been appointed, but each appointment is special and individual. Through each individual appointment, the university's focus shifts. Fields of study are changed, focus areas are changed and further developed, and new insights emerge. Each professor leaves his or her individual footprint. Like many other universities worldwide, the University of Vienna faces a multitude of challenges in these days. The rapid development of digital technologies has fundamentally changed the way how we teach and how we do research. The COVID pandemic forced us to transition to digital teaching formats faster than ever before, highlighting the importance of flexibility and adaptability, or you could call it resilience, of a university. And even more profound adjustments are challenging us, adapting to artificial intelligence. What this means for universities, for research, for teaching, for administration, remains still unclear in many respects. All universities struggle with these challenges. A similar fundamental issue is sustainability. Universities must take the lead here, fulfilling their role as a societal role model. At the same time, excellence and sustainability must not be mutually exclusive, but must be thought and developed together. Conflicting objectives must be addressed. And here, appointing new colleagues is crucial for these processes and for these challenges. It brings renewal to the university, fresh perspectives, new ideas, new expertise, new networks are essential for further developing a university and expanding research and teaching horizons as well as perspectives. So this is also true for Professor Dorit Geber, who joined us this year, this calendar year, as Professor of Gender and Politics at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. Raised in Toronto, she earned her PhD at New York University. She had fellowships at Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, the European University Institute, and the University of Chicago. She joined Central European University in 2011, became full professor in 2023, serving as the head of department and founding dean of undergrad studies. Professor Geva's research spans gender and politics, political sociology, and political and social theory. She wrote a book on military service politics in France and the United States and is published in prestigious journals. Professor Geva, I'm very delighted to have you join us, to welcome you as our new colleague at the University of Vienna, bringing your expertise to strengthen and enrich our institution. I wish you success and joy in your new time at the University of Vienna. Welcome, and thank you very much.
Vice Rector Hautsch, ladies and gentlemen, students, colleagues, and friends, it is with great honor that I introduce Professor Dorit Geva, an outstanding scholar, lecturer, and an inspiring voice in the fields of politics and gender studies. Since January of this year, Professor Geva has been a valued colleague at our Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Vienna. Her impressive career spans globally renowned institutions and reflects her profound dedication to academic excellence, leadership, and impactful research and teaching. The Vice Rector already mentioned it. Dorit Geva's academic path is closely tied to the Central European University, not only here in Vienna, but a much longer period of time already in Budapest. Her academic journey began, however, in Tel Aviv, in Israel, where she earned a BA in sociology before continuing at New York University for the master program and the PhD in sociology. At the New York University, her groundbreaking, historically comparative dissertation explored the intersections of military conscription, family, and statehood in France and in the United States. This work culminated in the publication of her widely acclaimed book, Conscription, Family, and the Modern State, a comparative study of France and the United States, published 2013 by Cambridge University Press and later translated into German, erschienen 2022 bei der Hamburger Edition unter dem Titel Militär und Familie, eine andere Geschichte moderner Staatlichkeit. The book has been widely lauded, earning Author Meets Critics sessions at prestigious academic conferences such as the Social Science History Association and the Western Political Science Association. Dorit Geva's academic appointments reflect her exceptional contribution to political sociology and gender studies. From a postdoctoral fellowship at the European University Institute in Florence, to her roles at the University of Chicago and Central European University, Professor Geva has consistently pushed the boundaries of her field. At the CEU, where she advanced from assistant professor to full professor, she not only chaired the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology, but also served as Dean of Undergraduate Studies, where she established the university's first undergraduate program, a testament to her innovative spirit and commitment to fostering educational opportunities. As a researcher, Dorrit Gevers' work bridges critical areas of political sociology, gender studies, and qualitative methods. From my own field of research, Dorrit, I would love to learn more about political ethnography or global ethnography, and also your way of archival research. Your work has received recognition and support through numerous grants and awards, including the European Commission Marie Curie Career Integration Grant, and distinctions such as the Best Paper Award runner-up from the European Sociological Association. Your thought-provoking analysis, such as those on the anti-gender movements in Europe and the radical right's reconfiguration of neoliberalism, underscore your dedication to tackling some of today's most urgent societal challenges. Beyond your research, you have contributed to building academic communities as a senior research associate at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna and a member of Network Promoting Peaceful Change. Throughout her career, Dorrit Gever has embraced interdisciplinary and international perspectives, spending time as a visiting scholar at leading institutions such as Sciences Po, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and the Institut Catholique in Paris. These experiences enrich her unique approach to understanding complex social and political phenomena through the lenses of feminist and queer theory, alongside rigorous empirical methods. Professor Gever's academic service is equally commendable. She has served on editorial boards, including the European Journal of Politics and Gender, and chaired committees like the Publication Committee of the Social Science History Association. Furthermore, she is a sought-after reviewer and advisor for esteemed funding bodies and journals, reflecting her reputation as a leading voice in her field. Beyond academia, Professor Gever has contributed thought leadership through op-eds and public lectures. Her insights have been featured in Haaretz, the Brussels Times, and Open Democracy, among others. And she has been interviewed by international media outlets such as Deutsche Welle, ORF, and The Atlantic only 1 week ago in the Standard series Wokeness und die Rechte, about the gender effects in the US elections. All these engagements exemplify her commitment to making scholarly knowledge accessible and impactful. In addition to her published works, Dorrit Gever is currently completing her second book, tentatively titled World Without Women. Using multi-sided ethnography, this ambitious project examines the interplay between neoliberalism and the radical right, shedding light on how patriarchal values and reshaping political and social landscapes in Europe and the United States. We might learn more about this interrelations from her inaugural lecture today. Professor Gever's work exemplifies the kind of scholarship that not only enhances our understanding of politics and society, but also addresses some of the most pressing issues of our time. Her leadership, teaching, and research continue to inspire students, colleagues as us, and scholars across the globe. Let us warmly welcome Dorit Geber and celebrate her remarkable contributions to academia and society. Thank you very much.
Pardon me for a moment. Thank you very much. I would like to first thank Vice Rector Nicolas Hauch and also Professor Michaele Pfadenhauer, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, for such an incredibly warm introduction and a generally very warm welcome to the University of Vienna. Thank you. I would like to say a whole bunch of thank yous, and I know this is perhaps for the audience the less interesting part, but these moments are so rare. There are many whom I would like to honor. I would like to thank my esteemed colleagues in my new department at the Institut für Politikwissenschaft, my esteemed colleagues throughout the university. I'm grateful to have here my new team that we're working together, colleagues in the area of gender and politics, Ms. Lucy Naudet, Dr. Ayşe Dursun, Dr. Katerina Hayek, and Dr. Firuze Farvardin. To my family who came from far and close, to my predecessors, brilliant women who have been key figures in founding and shaping the Institut für Politikwissenschaft, Professor Birgit Sauer and Professor Eva Kreisky, two very big shoes to fill. I'd like to thank also Ms. Dani Rayitz, who looked after all the details, big and small, without whom this event could not have happened. And now I really ask you to be patient, because there are many teachers and mentors over the years who have supported me. Professors Eva Illouz, Craig Calhoun, Stephen Lukes, Lynn Haney, Neil Brenner, Liz Clemens, Mabel Barazin, Kimberly Morgan, Myra Marks-Ferry, two who have deceased but who still inspire me and whom I still think about regularly, Professor Moish Bastone and Professor Mildred Schwartz, who was a mentor to me, and also to Professor Sylvia Bashevkin, who herself in turn has also continued to mentor me and who also came from Toronto to join us. She's a recent recipient of the very prestigious Canada Governor General Award. And thank you to everybody here. Across Europe and throughout the world, we are witnessing the emergence of what I am calling a new ethic of patriarchy. And this isn't simply a return to the old order. It's not simply the return to old forms of domination. It is, I argue, a reconfiguration, one that aligns with the collapse of a previous stage in neoliberalism. And this lecture is my attempt at trying to make sense of this. And I am working on a book, as was mentioned, so this is a very exploratory discussion from my side. Patriarchy is not new. It has a very, very, very long history. But what we're witnessing today is, I think, a new phase. It has its own history, and I think it's a new phase. Its uniqueness lies in how it has arisen in response to the collapse of the previous neoliberal order, which I call second wave neoliberalism. To understand it, we must understand the resurgence of patriarchy in the form of what I argue is an ethic. By ethic, I mean, and I'm already making reference here, to the relationship to neoliberal ethics. precepts guiding behavior, especially in relation to a project of self-making, a series of oughts reflecting dominant material logics and which at the same time help provide meaning for those enmeshed in it. Now, to arrive at this argument, I have to make a whole bunch of steps. Okay. Yes? Okay. The first is to explain what I mean by second wave neoliberalism. So I'm going to get into a little bit of history. Next, I want to argue that in parallel to elucidating the history of second wave neoliberalism, we must also excavate how patriarchy became submerged in second wave neoliberalism. And with this submergence, the theme of patriarchy also declined in feminist theory. So I'll have a few words about that later on, but not as much as I would have liked because of time. And then finally, after admittedly a lot of history and theory, I'll dive into some of my fieldwork to provide illustrations of what I have observed in actually existing politics. Although I've been studying radical right politics for over a decade, unintuitively, the key which opened my understanding of the present is the figure of Jordan Peterson, Canadian psychologist and guru to men throughout the global north, in many ways, and this is critical, the antithesis of the ever-hopeful Oprah Winfrey, the queen of American self-help culture, who dominated American culture in the 1990s until the end of her television show in 2011. Representing in perhaps the purest form a different project of self-making compared to Oprah Winfrey, Peterson's very somber ethic also contrasts to what on the surface looks like the ethic of abandon represented by Trumpism in the United States. And yet, what I will argue, what I aim to ultimately show as I take you through the next, 50 minutes or so, is that Jordan Peterson is actually quite different from Trumpism. But even then, nonetheless, I'll argue that both are born of the end of second wave neoliberalism. Each in their own way shows how patriarchal ethics have emerged from the vacuum left by the end of the second wave. So let's get started. It's no longer useful, I think, to refer to neoliberalism as a pure and ahistorical intellectual project. And by now, I would argue that the history is long enough that we can see stages in it. The first wave was from about, this is a rough cut, so from about the 1920s to the 1970s, marked by neoliberalism as an intellectual project, a utopian project, with its first institutional experiments. Intellectual histories, such as by historians Quinn Slobodian or Philip Mirowski, point to the critical interventions by thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek and his mentor Ludwig von Mises in this very university, I don't know exactly in which building, but very much at this university, who developed the anti-Keynesian political economic vision, emphasizing markets as producing spontaneous order. And these ideas were then brought to they crossed the Atlantic, especially in the post-war era, entering into a new generation through the so-called Chicago School, with deep influences in the establishment and the ideology of the Washington Consensus, and also in the founding of the key institutions of the international liberal order, such as the IMF and the World Bank. But the 1980s heralded something new, the beginning of what we can now, in retrospect, call the second wave of neoliberalism. So I don't think it's useful to try to find Hayek in purity into either the second wave or into the present. In the global north, so there's a much bigger history that I could give if I gave a global history, but we don't have time for that, and that's not my focus. But let me just give some taste of this, that in the global north, national projects in Ronald Reagan's America and Maggie Thatcher's Britain, began their own neoliberal revolutions. And then entering into continental Europe, especially in the 1980s, third wave social democrats, along with a shift in Christian Democrat politics, brought the politics of austerity, privatization, welfare reform, and labor market flexibility to continental Europe. It was in this second wave that the neoliberal ethic was born. First identified by Michel Foucault, but then hashed out by other scholars who have shown how neoliberal ethics from this second period have emphasized personal responsibility, narratives of empowerment, self-help, choice, and endless inner growth, like Oprah Winfrey. But I would add, it's important to pause and consider that this ethic is not a universal and necessary feature of neoliberalism. It's part of a certain period of neoliberalism. It's a defining feature of the second wave, but it doesn't mean that it's a defining feature of the next wave. Second wave neoliberalism arrived at a set of contradictory positions in relation to the role of the nuclear family and the role of men and women at home and in the marketplace. As traced by Melinda Cooper in her brilliant book, Family Values, American neoliberals like Milton Friedman in the 60s and 70s took a socially conservative turn by seeing the nuclear heterosexual family as part of the so-called spontaneous order. So in their view, economics were spontaneous and the nuclear family was spontaneous. But also, they introduced the beginning of the ethics of neoliberalism, particularly in terms of the racialized politics of implicitly racialized citizens who were between the lines, and often very much not between the lines, African Americans who were viewed as overly dependent on the state, were not married at enough, and who had low rates of marriage. That was becoming a social problem. So in this era, there became an emphasis on personal responsibility in marriage, which became wedded to the neoliberal project. In Europe, outside of Cooper's investigation, because her investigation is almost exclusively on the US, the influence of Catholics among the Ordo liberals and also the integration of neoliberalism into Christian democracy also ended up treating the family as a source of moral order and stability. So there is a conservative strand to the second wave. But then also neoliberalism became adopted and adapted by the third wave, the center-left social democrats who neoliberalized, arguing and integrating concepts like diversity, equal equality, economic opportunity, equality of opportunity for racial minorities, for women, promoting ideals of opportunity, choice, and diversity. So second wave neoliberalism by the 1990s had two faces that were always somewhat in tension by the time those two faces emerged in relation to the family and in relation to men's and women's roles at home and in the paid labor market. There was a socially conservative face, but there also was a progressivist, pro-diversity face. And from this soup, yet another hybrid emerged, neoliberal feminism. And as argued by Catherine Rottenberg, focusing especially on the figure of Sheryl Sandberg, Facebook CEO, and her Lean In motto, which is also by now not just a book, but it's a whole movement. She argued that Catherine Rottenberg, I should say, has argued by examining the kind of classic case of Sheryl Sandberg, that neoliberal feminism emerged in itself as a hybrid political rationality. Its progressivist side emphasized these themes of individualized empowerment through terms like a woman's need to determine for herself work-life balance, resilience, emphasizing the entrepreneurial, self-managing subject. And as argued also by Nancy Fraser, quite critically, and others, it depoliticized feminism by framing progress for women as a choice, by individualizing economic structures and economic opportunities rather than thinking structurally and thinking through structural critique. But it's important to emphasize that even with the rise of neoliberal feminism, the conservative face never went away. And in parallel further, I argue that another ideology was encrusted into second wave neoliberalism, what I call neoliberal patriarchy. So if we just think even in terms of kind of popular figures, there was a whole mythology around Sheryl Sandberg as the poster woman of neoliberal feminism, but let's not forget, it was also the age of Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Richard Benson, Jeff Bezos, as the faces of, I think, the other side of neoliberal patriarchy, which also became dominant in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. Like Sandberg, they offered an impossible narrative of success. And while outwardly progressive, they perpetuated forms of male dominance, especially in the workplace and in their respective firms and industries. So actually, patriarchy never went away. But more deeply, neoliberal patriarchy can be understood as the fusion of patriarchal dominance with the logics and ethics of neoliberal marketization. And so beyond these cultural symbols like Steve Jobs or Sheryl Sandberg, it operated through a restructuring of traditional patriarchal power in ways that aligned with market-based principles. Now, as theorized by a variety of feminists in the 1970s and 80s, capitalism and patriarchy are distinct systems of power, but which have aligned around control over women's labor, women's bodies, and women's reproduction. Unlike earlier forms of patriarchy that relied on more overt gender hierarchies, neoliberal patriarchy during this phase that I'm calling the second wave of neoliberalism maintained control also over women's labor, bodies, and reproduction by embedding these processes with a neoliberal emphasis on personal responsibility, choice, market efficiency, privatization, and all these terms that we know. Now, elements of this, I think, have been very productively identified by scholars like Nancy Fraser and others as having produced a crisis of care and social reproduction. That is the production of life and humans. And that the second wave, the crisis, or at least I should say the second wave of neoliberalism, especially put a lot of burden on women's shoulders, especially onto poor women, women of color, and migrant women through unpaid labor and poorly paid labor. I don't disagree with the social reproduction crisis analysis, but I think we can actually take the exact same factors and just slightly recast it, which is to see it as having been the marketization of patriarchy, positioning women as those who sustain male privilege at home and at work in the market. So to recap where we are now, I've argued so far that neoliberalism has a history, and I think that we have to start thinking of already stages, sub-stages in it, but also that patriarchy has a history, and that the two interacted in a very particular way during the second wave. Now, within this, I would like to emphasize that men also struggled. A similarly impossible set of precepts were offered to many men, to most men, the dream of extraordinary success. But in reality, this was not available to the vast majority of men. Working class men faced the brunt of economic restructuring, with job loss, diminishing trade union power. Middle class men were better positioned to adapt, but were also thrust into extremely intense work expectations in a highly competitive environment. Racialized men face compounded challenges. They often bore the brunt of policies such as dismantling of social safety nets, increased policing, and discrimination in the labor market. But that doesn't diminish the persistence of patriarchy, as it's theorized by scholars and activists like Shulamit Firestone in the United States, Maria Mies in Germany, and Silvia Federici, who's Italian but works in New York. According to them, patriarchy functions as a system that privileges men as a group over women as a group, even while organizing hierarchies among men, such as based on class, race, and so on. So patriarchy in some remained present, but was submerged. And what I have come to realize after many years, more or less in this field, is that feminist theory and the field of gender in politics, I think, has lost sight a little bit of the category of patriarchy. And I don't have time now to develop in detail why or how, and I don't even have a full answer. I just have some hypotheses, I suppose. But in any case, feminist theory, by and large, moved its gaze elsewhere in a very important stage of autocritique. But I think an unintended consequence has been that in parallel to the structural submergence of patriarchy in the second wave, there's also been a long pause in focusing on it from within feminist theory. So part of this project is also, actually to my own surprise, a kind of recuperation of the category and to see how it helps to make sense of the present. Okay, now back to a bit of chronological narrative. The contradictions between the promise of endless personal growth and success versus the realities of, in fact, the increasing precarity of labor markets, decline in absolute wages, and so on. These contradictions always existed, but certainly hit a turning point from 2008, 2010, more or less, the global financial crisis. Now, I'm just going to sketch out some very quick statistics here. So there is a plethora of data showing globally the dramatic rise in inequality between the rich and the poor, especially in terms of wealth, but actually on all elements. So I'm going to just trot out a few statistics about Austria, but Austria, has its peculiarities, but is not unusual globally. According to data from the 2022 World Inequality Survey, the wealthiest 10% of the population holds 60% of Austria's wealth. And the bottom 50% of the population owns close to zero. And this has not changed. What did change was the top 1%, which has only increased even further within the share of the top 10%. Austria is actually extreme within Europe, comparatively. And also, women in Europe hold considerably less wealth than men, at least according to a survey of single adult households in Austria. In terms of labor market patterns, so not wealth, but wages, in 2022, women's gross hourly earnings in Austria were 18% or 18.5% lower than men's. And this is higher than the EU average, which hovers at about 12.7%. So there are a lot of pressures. And in turn, in terms of at least the self-reporting to Statistics Austria about the unpaid housework and care work that men and women do, women report doing 65%, or just above 65% of all unpaid household work and care work. In Austria, men then report the other portion, 35%. So together, these factors suggest that women in Austria, and I would say that Austria is not unusual in this regard, in fact, is quite extreme in certain senses, that women in Austria are disproportionately burdened by the double shift of lower pay for hourly wages and a higher burden of unpaid work. So the overall picture for everybody is that most adults are running on a treadmill that's speeding up faster and people can't keep pace. Families are trying, or individuals or adults are trying to stay on their feet, but it's women who act as the shock absorbers, cushioning families from the jolts of economic instability by taking on a huge portion of unpaid work for caring, managing the household, cleaning, and so on. Now, you could say this has been a fix for neoliberalism, but I would put a finer point on this. It's not just a fix for neoliberalism, it's been a fix for neoliberal patriarchy, because it continued the operation of men's lower engagement with unpaid work and men's higher wages in paid work. Now this crisis, this pressure, or the other metaphor that I use, the treadmill with the increasing speed, has created a crisis which became increasingly apparent. And so scholars like Nancy Fraser, Wendy Brown, Sarah Ferris, Tariq Kouchi, and others have argued that this has brought on a reactionary rejection of neoliberalism and rising support for the radical right. So they draw a line between the rise of the radical right and this crisis, this squeeze. And indeed, 2024 has been a year of historic victories for radical right parties. In Austria, Germany, France, just recently Romania, the EU parliamentary elections, the United States presidential elections, the United States congressional elections, and so on. But that's not actually where I'm going to focus on now, because my aim here is not to focus so explicitly on party politics, but more to focus on the resurgence of patriarchy as an ethic. As part of the socio-political response to these crises, a kind of patriarchy which is no longer submerged, it's no longer hidden within second wave neoliberalism. I don't think the language of backlash is quite right, although I admit that I'm still thinking this through. But what I will show, and I'll soon dive into the field work, okay, which is not so much numbers, but kind of, I guess, colorful photos. What I intend to show now, is that there are a variety of patriarchal ethical projects underway, some of which entirely elide the market, and others which integrate a kind of purified neoliberalism into patriarchy. So for the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to take a deep dive into the world of Jordan Peterson, the canary in the coal mine, signaling the end of second wave neoliberalism and its submergence of patriarchy. And then with some remaining time, it'll be shorter, I'll give a glimpse into the cosmos of the MAGA movement in the United States, Make America Great Again movement, and the world around Donald Trump, so Trumpism, representing what I will argue is a very different variant of a new ethic of patriarchy. Now, I suspect that almost everybody here knows who Jordan Peterson is, but let me just in case give an introduction for those who don't. Peterson is a Canadian clinical psychologist. He's an author and a former professor at the University of Toronto who rose to global prominence in 2016 after opposing Bill C-16. This was a Canadian, or a proposal for a law that added gender identity and gender expression as protected categories in its human rights and hate crime protections. Peterson responded by posting very quickly his objections to the proposed bill on YouTube in these very simply produced videos, arguing that the law would compel speech by mandating the use of preferred gender pronouns. And his stance immediately sparked heated debates about free speech, political correctness, gender identity, and so on. And so, to his own surprise, he reports that to his own surprise, because he had otherwise had just a completely conventional academic career, he became an online sensation seemingly overnight, propelling him into the spotlight as a cultural commentator adored by legions of male fans. He further solidified his fame through his book from 2018, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. His lectures, interviews, and confrontations with progressive figures have only amplified his profile, making him a polarizing figure, but also one who was very admired by some. And there's a whole cottage industry online of content produced by men who claim that their lives were changed by him. He has since retired from the University of Toronto, claiming that he faced a hostile work environment due to woke political correctness and so on. He's now working on launching his own business, the Peterson Academy, based in a Miami production studio where supposedly university-level content is being produced. It will be launched online and can be accessed with a paid subscription, which is not very cheap. It's like $1,000 or something like that. Now, I had already been studying, so I have written on Hungary, on right-wing politics in Hungary, and one of the organizations or institutions that I look at quite a lot is the Matthias Calvinus Collegium. This is an Orban-backed think tank, sort of somewhere between a think tank and academic institution. It's a hybrid institution. And what caught my eye was that they hosted Jordan Peterson in Budapest in June 2022. So I decided to just get on the train, and from Vienna, I was already in Vienna, and to go see it. Because I had already been perplexed by, I didn't quite understand what this Peterson phenomenon was. So it took place in a very large arena. It was a sold-out event on a weekday evening. It was very much for an after-work crowd. The audience was mostly white-collar men who looked to me that like they had come from their office work after an after-work crowd. Tellingly, the entire event was in English, so that says a lot about the social class of the audience. So there were no translations or subtitles. It was just an all-English event. The stage set was really simple. And what surprised me and puzzled me for a very long time was just how somber and dark and serious the event was. The majority of it was just a dark stage with Jordan Peterson appearing in a kind of shiny blue-green suit and delivering a very long, very boring, but really long 2-hour lecture. Some pacing back and forth, looking very serious, introducing ideas that were basically like a bit of introduction to sociology, introduction to psychology, introduction to political science, introduction to philosophy. And I think that part of his gift is that he makes, and he was, by the way, a very popular lecturer at the University of Toronto, giving big introductory lectures. So he knows how to do this. And I think one of his gifts is that he makes very basic ideas seem like the biggest revelations, such as questions about the unity of cognition, like how do we all know that we're both, this microphone exists because you have your mind and I have my mind, so does the microphone exist? And that was, wow. And, but I think that part of the phenomenon is actually an educated audience, but that has no education in humanities and the social sciences. So it was really the first time that they encountered these ideas. They were kind of revelatory. But the message that I realized started being built up was that if people in the audience are confused, there's a reason for it, because the structure of our human mind doesn't necessarily have an inherent unity to it. And so this is where he switched into a favorite theme of his, which is the theme of order. So where do we find a sense of order? Where do we find a sense of order and coherence if our very cognitive structure is actually, in certain senses, incoherent? But then the lecture, then it moved for, I would say, about the last, I don't know, half an hour. It shifted from what I think is more a kind of lecture mode to sermon mode, because then he pointed his attention to the so-called neo-Marxists, of which Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault are apparently the greatest sinners, neo-Marxists, each of whom he claimed provided the wrong answers and were kind of promoting lies about the sources of order and chaos. Derrida, his sin is that he basically defied or claimed that there is no order. And according to Peterson, for Foucault, the problem is that Foucault claimed that order always comes from power, and that power gives order. And so these are the great sins of neo-Marxism. So Peterson urged at this point the arena of kind of software engineers, consultants, mostly men, who are the white-collar but cheaper workers for global corporations, not to fall into this false nihilism of power, for there are, after all, true sources of order. So what are these sources of order and meaning? And here, taking a somewhat Straussian turn, but by no means citing Leo Strauss, Peterson finished the lecture with a long account of what we can learn from the stories of Cain and Abel, Abraham, Moses, and the prophet Jonah from the Hebrew Bible. For him, these are myths. He's very clear that he's agnostic. But these are myths that, from which we learn to speak out and express what we believe in, to be moved by the Spirit. That like the prophet Jonah, whose first instinct was to escape the duties placed on him and speak the truth, he ultimately spoke the truth. And these days, he claimed, it's the nihilistic neo-Marxist spirit which prevails, stretching everything into power, into gender, sex, and class. And so that's not the right answer. We have to find the truth in these mythical archetypes. So it was a bit unclear to me still what the message was, I have to say. Then the final portion of the event, so that's what that picture is, was organized around questions from the audience, which Peterson himself would answer. They put up a QR code so people could submit questions. It was moderated by his wife, Tammy, whom he described on stage and repeatedly describes also in various interviews that she is not a nice person. And the question that she read out to him and the audience loved was, how do I stop procrastinating? And Peterson responded with a story he likes to repeat frequently. It's the tale of a male client he worked with as a clinical psychologist, and the story goes like this. This client was a 35-year-old man. He lived at home, still with his mother, who was just too soft on him, but he somehow had a girlfriend. He couldn't hold a job, and he would never, ever clean his room. But somehow, he still managed to have this girlfriend. The girlfriend got pregnant, and the man realized that somehow he needs to get his act together. And so, not knowing where to begin, he went to Peterson for help. And Peterson described how he gave this client at first tiny tasks to complete at home, to start up building competence, control, and responsibility. And it ultimately came down to the task of cleaning out his sock drawer. So the final words that Peterson uttered or kind of proclaimed in this mass event to all these men was, clean up your sock drawer. That was his prophetic final statement. Now, one of the recurrent memes on the internet in relation to Peterson is the injunction for men to clean up their rooms. It's as a way of starting small. And so the idea is that you start small in these small acts of self-discipline, And through this, you start making order. You make order in yourself as you make order in the world. This assuages anxiety, and critically, it's a forming of the self. And so this is, I think, where things start to get serious, because Peterson is a phenomenon. He's a global phenomenon. But what's so interesting is he doesn't promise happiness. On the contrary, he regularly affirms that life is miserable. He doesn't offer the promise of eternal inner growth. On the contrary, he says most of us are very, very limited. In fact, most of us, according to him, are not very talented, definitely not beautiful, and probably won't be successful. In fact, he almost never discusses work and career. He discusses instead these principles of small acts of order, of making order in the world and order in yourself. Small commitments, starting small, committing to, and that also then helps with committing to family. For the man, for example, the 35-year-old guy to commit to his girlfriend. And that ancient conceptions of order and meaning and the rather small and manageable steps men can take, or I shouldn't say men yet, people can take, are the most we can try and do to provide meaning and order for ourselves. In other words, Peterson is really the antidote to neoliberal ethics. He delivers a message which is apparently welcome. It's just evidenced by the fact of his spectacular popularity. So we are certainly no longer in the age of Oprah Winfrey, analyzed so brilliantly by Eva Illouz as representing a cultural artifact of the 90s, who represented the neoliberal promise of never-ending growth and success. Peterson's promises are actually very small. And obsessed with the figure of Michel Foucault, there's more than a little irony in Peterson's disdain for him, but it's also telling, because Foucault's late work on ethics focused on parrhesia, the act of risky truth-telling through which one forms an ethical self. And this is almost precisely a theme that Peterson repeats, but with a critical difference. Because in Peterson's project of truth-telling as self-making, these ethics are really only for men. Women fall for him into a rather different category. Caught in the fangs of socio-biological destiny, Peterson asserts, supposedly based on science, so he's always just, he says, oh, the latest science, but there's no footnotes. He repeats what seems like almost every single theme Simone de Beauvoir covers in The Second Sex, regarding the myth of the eternal woman. He trots out constantly claims about women ultimately reverting to biological needs based on passive submission to their destiny as reproducers of children. So as another example, there's Peterson, actually he repeats himself a lot if you start watching him a lot. So he likes to repeat a story where he was hired, so he claims, by a law firm in Toronto, a downtown corporate law firm, which was struggling to retain women lawyers. And they wanted to understand why, so they consulted with Peterson. And so his conclusion was, as women progress to their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation. They place less emphasis on their career and way more on having a child. So that was just the answer, the call of biological destiny. Okay. But he saves his sharpest vitriol for his transphobia. And to say just one example among many, and this is just a relatively recent interview of many that one can find online with him. There are a lot of young men with their own podcasts or YouTube interview shows that like to interview him, so this is one. He stated the following. This is a portion also of the video which is the most repeated, apparently. I mean, it shows it on the statistics of the YouTube link. Okay, so he says as follows. We now think that our outcomes are more determined by our own actions. Yes, but lurking underneath that, there is a hidden God. Lurking underneath all that, it's just that the God has become subjectivity. And that's what every degenerate Protestant liberal says now. I am what I am, and my pronouns adopt my identity. We've moved into a radical subjectivity. Now, the problem with that is that a radical subjectivity, especially one of impulse, is unbelievably immature and counterproductive. It just doesn't work any more than a room full of 2-year-olds would work. So what's the better idea? This subsidiary structure, it's the adoption of voluntary responsibility. So what he means is this produces, according to him, a way more complex identity. It's like, pick or take someone in your life, make a permanent relationship, work it out, have some kids, serve. So Peterson just prescribes for men a disciplined, even ascetic view of the self, of self-fashioning, against the false promises of endless growth, and with no recourse at all to the language of empowerment. Instead, he focuses extensively on responsibility, but also not the kind promoted by neoliberal ethics. It has no relationship to the market for him, his concept of responsibility. And while this in itself might not seem radically patriarchal, it becomes more apparent that his appeal to the manosphere lies in the sharp lines he draws between men and women, with women, to use again the words of Simone de Beauvoir, just the playthings of their hormones. And woe to the woman who tries to claim otherwise. Okay, so that's the problem with feminism. It's a denial that women's biology determines who they are. And transgenderism is mobilized even more sharply as a point of contrast to his ethic of patriarchy, because in his cosmos, it's in fact having no ethic. It's an abandon, a complete absence of ethics and self-discipline. It's childishness, it's immaturity, it's submission to the gods of consumerism, liberal Protestantism, neo-Marxist wokeism, and an immaturity of the self. So women submit to nature, transgender persons submit to a childish lack of ethical commitments and are people who just won't grow up. Ethics, then, from what remains, are just the domain of men. Now, to move forward and start arriving towards the end of this lecture, I'll present much more briefly some observations of a different variety of patriarchal ethics in the world of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, which is quite different from Peterson. So these observations are drawn in part from first-hand observations at the Conservative Political Action Committee, that's CPAC, which took place outside of Washington, D.C. in February of this calendar year. This is an annual conservatism conference in the United States. It has a long history. It used to really be a place where conservatism was genuinely debated, or at least American conservatism was genuinely debated, but like everything on the right in the United States, it's been really taken over by Trumpism, by the MAGA movement. And this year was really, the year that I went, was an extravaganza of Trumpism, but also the most international CPAC meeting ever, with a lineup of figures like the UK's Nigel Farage, Liz Truss, Argentina's Javier Milei, El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, an ongoing presence all the time of Steve Bannon, who was also then doing these kind of mobile interviews with all of these figures, and of course Donald Trump in the flesh, ultimately on stage and firing up the crowds. It was such a carnivalesque bonanza of radical right-wing politics that it's actually quite hard to know where to begin. But what helps me is that I'm trying to focus on a specific theme now, so on the variant of patriarchal ethics which saturated CPAC and Trumpism. If Peterson promotes an ethic that demands sincere and humorless effort and introspection, and which demands exclusion of women and transgender persons from these existential stakes, Trumpism represents something different. So to take you back, I argued earlier in the lecture that second wave neoliberalism came to combine a contradictory mix of both conservative family values and progressivist values. My conclusion or my argument about Trumpism is that it doesn't reject neoliberalism as such, but Trumpism purges neoliberalism of its progressivist diversity lineage. It bluntly presents a more coherent alignment between conservatism and neoliberalism. And with this, patriarchy is no longer submerged, it's very much celebrated. And so I have a lot of observations, but because of time, I'm only gonna cut it down considerably. What I want to say is that while Trumpism encourages commodification of the self in ways that look like second wave neoliberalism, there are strict limits to this self-making. And the limits are adherence to the patriarchal order, which in Trumpism expresses literally adherence to the rule of the father, upholding a natural gender hierarchy of men over women and relatedly of natural sexual difference. And so the rule of the father, so it's kind of almost quasi-patrimonial, but for the 21st century, we find that the rule of the father operates as the critical organization of power, privilege, profit, distribution of roles, positions in government, and so on. Within that, we also find intense commodification of the self, but stripped now of its liberal, progressivist diversity lineage. And also, markets don't have morals in this framework. Family and nation do. So like the Peterson phenomenon, but in a very different way, the articulation is quite different, we are far from second wave neoliberal ethics. So I was struck, for example, by the almost complete lack of mention of Ronald Reagan throughout days of a conservatism conference, many panels. It's like Reagan is ancient history, like Julius Caesar. You know, why would you talk about Ronald Reagan at CPAC 2024? So the only, I don't know how well the pictures appear, but let me try to explain to you. What there is on Saturday night, a gala dinner at CPAC, which is called the Ronald Reagan Dinner. It is expensive, and this is kind of for the wealthier crowd, and part of it is an auction. And so the funds from the auction help fund the organization. So this was the only time that I actually saw Ronald Reagan, that he had anything to do with this conference. But then, if you can make out on the right, so this was what was happening on stage before the speakers came. It was during the appetizers, I think. There was a painter on stage who first painted live on stage this painting of Jesus Christ. That's the painting on the right. And then after that, a painting of Donald Trump. So even the Ronald Reagan dinner had to have this, you know, I mean, I could understand the painting of Jesus Christ, but it's, you know, as if these two figures are the same. But still, it was really dominated by Trumpism. And the ethic overall is not at all of earnest joylessness. So it's not at all like the Peterson world. And there's a lot of pleasure in dark humor. So, for example, this is a photo of this water that was kind of being sold as a joke of woke tears that were being sold for melted snowflake tears. So there's a lot of, but also note the commodification, right? So it is a political statement, but it's also a product. Women who don't know their place in this world are often the object of ridicule, so, but in a kind of mean but funny way. So this was an entire panel seriously called Catfight. And the premise was that, basically to cut it short, that Michelle Obama and Kamala Harris were going to have a catfight over who ultimately gets to run the Democrat Party and become the next presidential candidate. So there were seriously 4 people having a discussion for 45 minutes in a panel about the catfight that they anticipated. The CPAC audience, although diverse in social class, was almost entirely white. But what they united around was deference to Trump's uniqueness as a patriarchal figure from whom nobody expects any kind of ethic of self-discipline. His dominance, deference to him is seemingly natural and effortless, the natural privilege of the rule of the father. Supporters, in turn, could generate considerable playing of the self, pushing self-making far further than I had anticipated, but still within limits of the deference to this order. So rather than focus, and I'm going to conclude with this as my kind of last example from research, so I'm not going to focus on Donald Trump. I did see him, and he's an incredible performer, and it was very memorable, but I'm actually going to focus on somebody else who I think encapsulates so much. This is Lady Maga, who is a drag persona performed by a man called Ryan Woods. And each day of CPAC, Lady Maga appeared in a new extravagant outfit, positioning himself, and he's very clear that he's a he. I'll say more about that in a moment. So positioning himself in this very long corridor. It was a huge Congress hall, and it had a very long corridor that was dedicated to the Trumpist MAGA media ecosystem of sort of bottom-up podcasts and YouTubers, and there's really, you could really see it physically. And so very strategically, Lady Maga would always present himself there, attracting much attention with an ongoing stream of people taking selfies and actually being delighted. So Lady Maga was a kind of spectacle within a spectacle. On the first day, the photo on the right, Lady Maga wore this Gone with the Wind style dress, a kind of wink to the old order of the white femininity of the slave-owning class. And thus, there was a kind of wink there to white supremacy and the gender order. And if you see on the right, there's the bag, the Lady Maga bag. So in it, Lady Maga handed out a manifesto. I don't think that many people looked at it, so you could kind of tell actually who were really the researchers. So I took the manifesto. And in this, I mean, I know you, I didn't think that you in the back could read it or even up close, but I'll just kind of hone in on the message, more or less. This is a manifesto where Lady Maga is very clear that he is a conservative and that he rejects transgenderism. So for example, he writes, it terrifies me to think that had I been born to woke parents today, they'd seek to drug and mutilate me and tell me I'm a girl. The manifesto also professes total loyalty to Trumpism, saying, I've been to hundreds of Trump events, I'm the biggest patriot ever. Okay, so it's a manifesto clarifying that he's a conservative, that he aligns with Trumpism, that he's loyal, and that he rejects transgenderism. Lady Maga then represents a radical play of the self, and to a certain degree advances an empowerment narrative, because it is a situation of somebody who is actually incredibly entrepreneurial in terms of making themselves known. They have a huge social media policy following. And so there are elements of this that I think are found in the lineage of second wave neoliberalism. But at the same time, Lady Maga's entire persona is structured to support the authority of Trump and to reinforce a strict binary view of gender, aligning with the patriarchal ethic that naturalizes male and female roles and the intersectional racial politics of dominance, hierarchy, order, and deference. So even Lady Maga, resolutely a man performing drag, still swears loyalty to Donald Trump, and in so doing, represents what I argue is this new ethic of patriarchy. I'll conclude now. In a much repeated statement by Antonio Gramsci in the Prison Notebooks, Gramsci wrote, "Crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, this period in between, a great variety of morbid phenomena appear." So are we at such an interregnum? Perhaps. In Gramsci's logic, these moments are full of contradiction, in which peculiar cultural and political forms emerge. And Peterson and Lady Maga, to me, look precisely like such peculiar forms. Second wave neoliberalism has reached its end, at least so I have argued. However strange or contradictory Lady Maga and Jordan Peterson are, they help us to see the contours of a new world struggling to be born. Thank you. Now we could have some questions, or should we just go and enjoy wine and we just go and have wine and, okay. So I think then my role is perhaps to indicate that there is wine and some nibbles in here. Thank you very much, and thank you to you.